Thank you, Larry. Thank you. We are in Micah chapter 7. We're going to finish up Micah and probably get this mic to sit in there, right? Probably go get into Zephaniah as well today. And I've been thinking this past week, I had kind of in my mind where we were going next after the minor prophets. But I don't know about you. I'm feeling a little bogged down in the minor prophets, to be quite honest with you. It's because it's just you're dealing with prophets who are telling the same group of people the basic same message, and we're just kind of we're getting to a point. So I'm going to switch. We're going to go through Zephaniah, and then I'm going to step away from the minor prophets for a while. I have some booklet material I'm going to share with you, and we'll do a little more of like a book study on the nature of God. That I found, and so we're going to use that here in the next coming weeks. And so look for that Wednesday night when you come in. I didn't have time. It's a pretty large booklet, and so I'm going to have to make the copies and get them bound in some way for you. So look for that Wednesday night when you come in. You can grab it. We'll still be in Zephaniah by then. But then when we finish Zephaniah, we'll step back away from the minor prophets for a little while, do this other study, and then we'll come back and finish them up. I just feel like maybe that'll give everybody just a change of pace and just a change of thought for a few weeks, and then we can come back and finish our discussion of all of these minor prophets. So jump back into Micah chapter 7. We've been dealing with the various aspects of Micah's prophecy. He's prophesying to which group, north or south? Is he dealing with Israel or Judah? Okay. I'm hearing both. I'm just waiting to see if we can have some kind of confirmation of that. Take a vote. Who says Judah? Marley, anybody else agree with Judah? Who thinks it's Israel? Okay, he does deal with both. I guess it's a bit fairer way to describe that. He deals with both tribes or both kingdoms. In relationship to that. And he focuses, I think, at times on Judah in a more prominent way. And because if you recall, he's part of that. I can just show it to you, actually. I just remembered that I put my time chart back up here. But if you recall our chart, anything in yellow are the kings of Israel. The kings of Judah are in green. And if you notice that most scholars would say that Micah, notice he's in green as well, that his predominant message is for those in Judah, though he does address both of those groups. And if you recall, he kind of is in the midst of kind of bridges some really bad kings. Ahaz, if you recall, we went back, if you remember at the very beginning of when we studied Micah, at the very beginning we went back to 2 Chronicles 28, and we read about Ahaz and the kinds of vile things that he was doing in relationship to children and the people. And we talked about how bad things were probably going on in the early part of Micah's work. Then who comes on the scene? You can see it on the screen. Who's the last of the good kings there? Hezekiah, right? And so Hezekiah, so Micah he's kind of involved in both. He's prophesying during the time period of a pretty wicked king, Ahaz, and others, and then he actually is living when Hezekiah comes on and tries to kind of steer the people right. That just unfortunately doesn't last long. Buys Judah a reprieve, buys them a little extra time. Israel falls long before Judah does, but still nonetheless, the judgment of God is still coming. Difficulties that they created because of their behaviors. And I'll bring that timeline back up when we get into Zephaniah here in a little bit. So Micah's finishing up. In Micah chapter 6, you had a courtroom scene, basically. He calls the mountains and the hills and everything to come and be witness. And basically God says through Micah to the people, what did I do to deserve all this? Well, all I did was brought you out of Egypt and blessed you and fed you and cared for you and provided for you and did everything. Why have you rebelled against me? Why have you rejected me? And they had been so distant, by the point Micah writes that, They had become so distant from God that what they say they thought maybe they should do in order to appease Him. Yeah, make all kinds of, maybe a 1,000 rams will do it, and then they ultimately even say what? Yeah, your firstborn. Maybe the Lord wants our firstborn to be given unto Him. And so they had been so far removed from their relationship with God that they felt like those kinds of things. But what did He ask for? There were 3 things in chapter 6 that he said they really needed to be focused on. Anybody remember what they were? Okay, justice is one. There you go. Verse 8. To do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God, there in chapter 6. And so that's the conversation that Micah has been having that we've already studied. And it sets up this final chapter as it relates to these things. So, verse 1 of chapter 7. Woe is me, for I am as when they have gathered the summer fruits, as the grape gleanings of the vintage. There is no cluster to eat. My soul desired the first ripe fruit. The good man is perished out of the earth, and there is none upright among men. They all lie in wait for blood. They hunt every man his brother with a net. Let me stop for a minute. Woe is me, for I am as. Who do you think's saying that? There at the beginning. So is this God, a direct message from God? Is this Micah personally? Is this somebody else? No one wants to go out on that limb. Okay, so I potentially it's God speaking. Possible. Yeah. So some of the language might lend itself to me to maybe lean a little more to the prophet. This is kind of his summary. He's been bringing the prophecy, the message of the Lord so far, and then this is kind of his thought processes through all of this knowledge and information. Again, that's just my contention or my belief as it relates to this narrative. So he's looking around in verse 2. The good man is perished out of the earth. Can't find anybody. There is none upright among men. They all lie in wait for blood. They hunt every man his brother with a net. Now, go ahead, Brian. I'm sorry. You're good. Yeah. And so there's phrases throughout the text that seems to point that the prophet is speaking from a very personalized point of view. And so he looks around. Now, let me ask this question: is he right that there's nobody good? No, yeah. This is a generalization to emphasize the point. As a whole, the nation had become what? Corrupt and evil, right? As a whole, the nation had become corrupt and evil. And so when he looks out at the nation, if you were to try to just generalize what the state or condition of the nation, he says you can't find anybody upright. We know, if you want to get technical for a second, that it's not specifically true because where is he? He's in the nation, okay? And so is he a good man? Yes, right? So there's, and the text in all of these prophets always seem to speak of a remnant, a small pocket that they encourage to try to stay faithful despite the invasions that are coming as God brings judgment. So this is a generalization. I don't think it's in the same vein as Elijah. Remember, Elijah, I think, really believed it. Elijah believed when he says to God, I alone am left to serve you. And God says to him what? There's thousands yet that have yet to bow their knee to Baal. And so Elijah had a misconception because he genuinely believed he was literally alone among the people. Micah, I think, is just generalizing, try to emphasize how evil and corrupt the people become. Go ahead, Brian. I'll come back to you.
Paul made a similar generalization, Romans chapter 3, verses 10 through 12. As is written, there is none righteous, no, not one. Speaking about both Jews and Gentiles. There is none that understands, there is none that seeketh after God. They're all gone out of the way.
Right, right. He's emphasizing how widespread the problem had become. Good, Jim.
He said, I've come to the point where I just can't take anymore.
Yeah,
God, do something.
yeah. He's a frustrated prophet because, and many of them were because most. Yeah, some of it was confusing, number one, but they also had the problem of the fact that nobody really listened to him. Very rarely do you have a prophet show up. Probably the most successful in some ways of those prophets that went and brought a message would have been who? Who we already studied. You think about that for a second. Who actually went to the place, took him a little while to get there, but went to, Jonah, right? Jonah, finally, when he gets to Nineveh, is probably the most successful prophet. He goes in there and says, listen, you got 30 days, straighten up, or God's going to bring judgment. And everybody from the top down went, we better put on the sackcloth and ashes and start getting penitent in relationship to God. And so Jonah actually was listened to, but he didn't like it. He didn't want them to listen. He was hoping they would ignore him. But then you got folks like Micah who are doing what God had charged them to do, but nobody's really paying any attention or honoring the message from the Lord that they're bringing. And so he longs for a better day. Yeah. 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 And I was anecdotally, even when you speak in audiences, you can. I generally know when I've lost an audience. You can feel it. you can sense it. And generally, when you hear me quit abruptly, it's usually because I just let out a secret. Sorry, never mind. But that's nothing. That pales in comparison to what these men went through. To think that they kept going to a nation of people and imploring them to right their relationship with Jehovah, honor the covenant, quit being adulterous. That's the word that keeps coming up in these narratives as they're breaking their covenant with God, and they're just ignored, or they try to appease them. It's some are imprisoned. It's really sad. So the manner in which these men were treated. Yes, go ahead, Bob. Yeah, I think so, Bob. I think that's a symbolic reference to the idea that things were better. I long for when we first started building our relationship with Jehovah, and the greatness and the great benefits that brought to the nation. And had they only returned to that mindset, the blessings would have returned. God repeatedly told them that. So I think you're right. I think that's what he's pointing to when he uses that description. Yeah. Yeah, they had lost that fervor, and he longed for when they would return. And there's several references in the New Testament that talk about purge out the leaven, so you can become a new lump, so you can kind of get back to that fervor and zeal and heart for God that you once had. And so there's lots of parallels. Verse 3 says that they may do evil with both hands. I mean, if this hand was busy doing evil, they wanted to find some evil for this hand to be involved in as well. I mean, that's how they were overwhelmed in pursuit of that which was sinful and evil. He says, with both hands earnestly, the prince asketh, and the judge asketh for a reward, and the great man, he uttereth his mischievous desire. So they wrap it up. Everybody's got what? Seemingly. The judge asketh, the prince asketh. What do you think they're asking for? Favor and benefit, right? If you want me to respond favorably to you, you're going to have to help me out a little bit. And we talked a little bit we spoke about that out of chapter 6 as well, if you recall, about how they maybe chapter 5, but how they had become consumed with that concept and become so greedy they wouldn't pass the right judgments. They would take payoffs. Even the great man, and I think the emphasis of that is even people who who should know better, who should have been leading and giving people the right kind of example to follow. Even those men had just succumbed to the evils and mischievous desires wrapped up in all of it. The best of them is as a briar. The most upright is sharper than a thorn edge. The day of thy watchman and thy visitation cometh. Now shall be their perplexity. That's some complicated words in some ways, but he's simply saying that you've been wrapped up in all this evil, and it's going to overwhelm you now. You're going to be judgment's coming. A visitation is coming. All of the challenges that you've brought upon yourself, God's going to render the judgment that is to come. So trust ye not in a friend. Put ye not confidence in a guide. Keep the doors of thy mouth from her that lieth in thy bosom. For the son dishonoureth the father. The daughter riseth up against her mother. The daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies are the men of his own house. When you give yourself over to evil continually, and you are so overwhelmed with mischievous and sinful evil behaviors, you reach a point where you can't trust anybody. You can't trust anybody. He says a man's enemies will be where? In his own house. Now you think about how frustrating that is. You think about the imagery of that on one side it's bad enough that you might have foes and enemies and those who mean you harm from without. But now you sleep with one eye open because you can't even trust the people of your own family, your own household. That's how bad it got. That's sad. It's really sad to think that they chose that. That's the world and life that they chose for themselves over the blessings of God. And I wish we had a better way, and all we can do is just keep trying and keep putting this message forth. But I wish we could get our world to see that what kind of world are they choosing for themselves? Are we really? Is that really what we want? Do we really want? Do what you want, say what you want, act like you want, no repercussions, no consequence. No. Do we really want evil to be rampant? And that, but that's the truth is, when you're talking about a nation, when you're talking about a law, it's in many senses all about what those people choose for themselves. And yeah, there'll be a remnant. There always is a remnant of those who are striving to do what's right and striving to honor God. But sometimes the remnant, as far as being able to convince a nation or a large, times the remnant's unsuccessful. These prophets, in very specific ways, they aren't unsuccessful in the sense that they did what God wanted them to do, so that when you do what God wants you to do, that's success. But they didn't persuade the nation out of the trouble and impending difficulties they were bringing to themselves. It just kept getting worse. But it's sad. They chose this. They chose this path, and now they can't even trust their own family members. Now there's dishonor everywhere and distrust, and that's just hard. It's sad. Yep, go ahead, Andy. Yeah. 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 And though the nature in which God addresses, Israel was a literal physical nation of people that God governed and had covenant with in this time period. And so that aspect is different than what you have today. But the basic concept doesn't change. That if there's not some moral standard by which is governing a people, then chaos and evil will ensue. And the more you erode at that moral standard, and God's the best source for that moral standard, and that's the message. Go ahead, Brian. Go ahead. You're good. You're good. It's on heart.
And number two, Jesus said this very same thing in Matthew chapter 10. I won't read the whole thing, but he said that think not that I've not come to send peace on earth, I came not to send peace but sword.
Yeah.
And he'll put a man's foe shall be they of his own household.
Yeah.
So even then,
Yeah.
it will be divisive. And it's really hard with a lot of families. They'll have family members, even in interfaith, they'll have family members who are lost. And what do you do?
Yeah.
So it's very difficult.
Yeah.
Very, very difficult.
Yeah. Jesus, it is an amazing thought when you think about the fact that even before he really begins to build his he hasn't died, and by that moment he still has yet to die and be buried and raised again, but he's already letting folks know, listen, my kingdom's a lot different than what you expect. And for those who come to me, there's great blessing and benefit. But for those who reject that message, it creates friction and divisiveness, even in some of the most closely knit connections. So here's that verse Brian mentioned earlier in our study, verse 7. Therefore, I will look unto the Lord. Don't you love Micah? You got to love him. Because that was miserable, right? Verse 1 through 6 is miserable. This prophet is miserable among the people. But he recognizes what? Where do you look when you're miserable? Yeah, you look to God. You look to the Lord. Yeah. And so what might be going on around him, I'm not saying it doesn't have an effect on him, but it doesn't overwhelm him to where he disconnects. Therefore, I will look unto the Lord. I will wait for the God of my salvation. My God will hear me. Rejoice not against me, O mine enemy. When I fall, I shall arise. When I sit in darkness, the Lord shall be a light unto me. I will bear the indignation of the Lord because I have sinned against him until he plead my cause and execute judgment for me. He will bring me forth to the light, and I shall behold his righteousness. Mike acknowledges he's not a what in terms of his humanity. He's not perfect, right? I think he acknowledges that when he talks about that he had sinned, and but that the response the sinner needs to have is once you recognize you're a sinner, you look to the Redeemer. You look to the one who can provide salvation in the midst and overcome your sins. That's the recognition. There are basically two groups of people here, and they're all sinners. One group who chose sin and continued in it. Another group who has sin in their lives at times, but continue to look to the Lord for forgiveness and look to the Lord to strengthen them and make them upright and redeem them. And that sums up the world from the beginning. Yeah. And we've just got to choose to resist the temptation of being overwhelmed by that evil and reach out to the righteousness of God in the midst of it. So then she that is mine enemy, verse 10, that she that is mine enemy shall see it, and shame shall cover her, which said unto me, where is the Lord thy God? Mine eyes shall behold her, now shall she be trodden down as the mire of the streets. That's pretty explicit in terms of the sad reality of what he's saying there. Reminds me a lot of Noah, right? Noah, for many, many years building that ark. And while he's building it, he's also trying to do what? Preach and teach and communicate to the people of the challenges they had brought. And so he, to none effect except for his family, who ultimately are on that ark with him. But imagine those who scoffed and mocked at the notion and the preaching and teaching of Noah, how they felt when the rain started. And they looked over to that ark, and for the first time, the door's shut. And you don't hear the rustling of the progress of the animals heading to the ark, and you don't see all that work and labor that had been going on for so long. And the rain starts. And so Micah says, listen, my enemies may say all kinds of things about me, against me. They may reproach, they may do all kinds of things. But their mockery now is going to come back to haunt them. When the enemies arrive and they have no refuge and no place to run and no place to find comfort, it's a reality that'll come in where they'll know we should have listened to what Micah said. In the day that thy walls are to be built, in that day shall the decree be far removed. In that day also he shall come even to thee from Assyria and from the fortified cities, from the fortress even to the river, and from sea to sea, and from mountain to mountain. Notwithstanding the land shall be desolate because of them that dwell therein, for the fruit of their doings. Feed thy people with thy rod, the flock of thine heritage, which dwell solitarily in the wood and in the midst of Carmel. Let them feed in Bashan and Gilead, as in the days of old. According to the days of thy coming out of the land of Egypt, will I show unto him marvelous things. And so, judgment, and what's he also been talking about on the other side of that eventually? Spent a lot of time talking about messianic prophecies right out of Micah, the hope that comes in Jesus ultimately. And so you see some of that imagery, I believe, here again, when he talks about here comes the judgment, but then long for days, like when you came out of the bondage of Egypt, when the nations shall see and be confounded at all their might, they shall lay their hand upon their mouth, their ears shall be deaf. They shall lick the dust like a serpent. They shall move out of their holes like worms of the earth. They shall be afraid of the Lord our God, and shall fear because of thee. And so reversal. Judgment to the physical nation of people. Restoration and empowerment that comes later through the kingdom of Jesus that he establishes. And these references, all of the hope messages within Micah and the other prophets for the most part, all of the message of hope and restoration and benefit that all comes really in fruition in the days of Jesus. Although Judah in particular gets to come back after 70 years, they come back into the promised land. They do rebuild the temple, not nearly what Solomon had built, but they rebuild it. Interestingly, though, remember, though, that so you had Solomon's temple, you got the one that's built when they come out of captivity. By the time you get to the days of Jesus, really the temple in Jerusalem was more attributed to who? To Herod, right? Herod had come in and become king, governor, whatever you wanted to reference his leadership over that region, and he wanted a spectacle, a place that rested there that was more of a tribute to him. So the temple, in many ways, had become more about Herod than it was about God, even in the days of Jesus. We think about that. Remember that fact when you see Jesus' encounters with people at the temple, when he arrives on the scene, and on a couple of different occasions, he's pretty frustrated with what he finds there at the temple. But no wonder, because the temple really had lost its purpose, even the purpose that it was rejuvenated with when these folks come out of captivity and return back to Jerusalem. So who is God? Who is a God like unto thee? No one's like the Lord, that pardoneth iniquity and passeth by the transgression of the remnant of his heritage. He retaineth not his anger forever, because he delighteth in mercy. The arrival of Jesus, and just simple thought to consider, But the arrival of Jesus on the scene is the greatest act of mercy that man had ever witnessed. To think that God had brought a series of judgments on various times upon His own people, upon the nations round about, various moments in the history of man where God brought judgment. But He always sought out to allow a remnant to come to Him and to find mercy and grace and repentance and restore their relationship back to Jehovah. And Jesus is the catalyst to that. There's no other God, there's no God like Him that can pardon iniquity. I think that principle, by the way, is understood by those New Testament Jews, because if you recall, Jesus tells the woman, I believe that's the right scene, when He tells the woman they had caught in adultery, and they tell her to go away and sin no more. And now my brain's trying to make sure that's the right scene. But at any rate, where they question Jesus, who is He to think that He can forgive sins? And Jesus says, you know who can forgive sins. God can, and He's trying to get them to make the connection that He is Jehovah. He's God made manifest in the flesh. God can pass over sin. God can pardon iniquity. God can be merciful. God can allow Himself to put His anger away and not let it rule Him and govern over Him. Because He does what at the end of verse 18? It's an important phrase. He delighteth in mercy. You know, God challenges us on various occasions to let mercy be part of the character of who we are. And in fact, God on many occasions within Scripture, we studied this I think a couple of weeks ago in a sermon, that there are going to be times where we have to choose mercy over something else that may be good within itself. But mercy is the most powerful in those moments. God's anger is just. His consequences that He brings against people are always just, but He prefers and delights in mercy, not the judgment side. God needs to do that at times, but He delights in mercy. He'll turn again. He will have compassion upon us. He will subdue our iniquities, and Thou wilt cast all their sins into the depths of the sea. You basically have two choices, right? Either we have to hold the accountability for our transgressions, iniquities, and sins personally. If we have to hold them personally, what happens to us? Well, the wage of sin is death, right? So if there's no answer to iniquity, lawlessness, and sin, and evil, if it's within ourselves, we have no ability whatsoever to help ourselves correct that situation or provide. We just have to accept the consequence. God says, I can subdue them. We can't subdue them. It's obvious they're having trouble subduing them because they just keep getting into more and more and more trouble. But when you turn to God, He can subdue them. He's the great answer to sin and evil. And Thou wilt cast all their sins in the depths of the sea. When you throw something into the depths of the sea, they're what? They're gone. God can erase it. That's the powerful message of that. God can erase sin as if it never happened. We may at times have to bear personal challenges because of our choosings. We can't always outrun the choices that we made and the consequences of them. David's the perfect example of that, right? Even in the Psalms when he said, my sin is what? Ever before me. He'd been forgiven. He'd been even shown mercy and being allowed to live because he had broken a law that had the penalty of death upon him. So he had been extended mercy, had been forgiven, but he understood the consequences of that choice was still hanging around. So we may not be able to, but we can know that sin is no longer held to our charge. It's gone. God can do that. God can take those sins and those iniquities and throw them in the depths of the sea. Thou wilt perform the truth to Jacob and the mercy to Abraham, which Thou hast sworn unto our fathers from the days of old. God made some conditional and some unconditional promises. sometimes God would say, if you do this, or if you do that, or if you follow this path, if you stay focused on these things, then this will be the result. This is what you'll receive in because of that. Sometimes God just says, this is what I'm going to do. And He doesn't measure whether, in a sense, we deserve that or not. Sometimes God just says, this is the way things are. Micah is reminding them of that. Some of the promises that God made were going to be held true, and nothing was going to stop that. The condition of the people, whether it be a remnant that was honoring God or the whole, was not going to stop the promises made. And the mercy of Abraham that came through that original promise is culminated in Jesus. And the Galatian writer wrote in Galatians chapter 3, and he talked about those who have become children of God. And he said, when you became children of God, you became heirs according to the promise of Abraham. And so even the Apostle Paul in the New Testament times in Galatians chapter 3, he's referencing not promises that made just shortly before that period of time. He's referencing the promises that the original promise made clear back to Abraham, that through his seed all nations of the earth will be blessed. And so he's reminding them, we might become evil, we might become sinful, we might be horrible, but that remnant will keep God focused on honoring that promise made to Abraham. And there may be times where he'd like to reconsider. It happened at least once, right? In the days of Moses, when they come out, his spies come back, and God says to Moses, listen, I'm just going to tell you what, I'm just going to wipe these ones out. But he wouldn't have changed the promise, by the way. Because all he said was, I'm going to wipe these ones out, and you and I will just, your folks can, or your family lineage can just start over again. And so it would not have been a denial of the promise. It would have just been a change in how he was going to accomplish it. Moses pleaded the case of the people and allows them to survive. But you're not going to stop the promises of God. And Micah wanted them to appreciate that God would honor what he had promised. God would honor what he had said he would fulfill in them. Go ahead, Brian.
Psalm 105 says, He hath remembered His covenant forever, the word which He commanded to 1,000 generations, which covenant He made with Abraham and his Israelites, and confirmed the same unto Jacob for a law, and to Israel for an everlasting.
Yeah. And nothing would persuade it away. Any other thoughts, comments, questions about the book? Bell ring here within the next few seconds or so. Go ahead, Zane. Yeah. Yeah. From everlasting. Yeah. Right, yeah. Because he's been there all the time. Yeah. Yeah. All right. For Wednesday, read all of Zephaniah. I'm going to cover it. I've looked at it several times already, and the way it's structured, it's 3 chapters. The theme really doesn't change a lot within it, so there'll be a pretty simple approach. We'll cover Zephaniah, Lord willing, on Wednesday. I'll get the new study out to you as well on Wednesday, so you can prepare for Sunday. And then, like I said, we'll finish Zephaniah. We'll switch gears for a little while, just take a little break, look at something else for I said weeks. It's probably at least 2 or 3 months to get through this